Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Owen Gill, and I'd like to welcome you all to this lecture in our Robert Boyle Winter School series. But of course, we're no longer in winter, so this would be more correctly described as our Winter Spring series. We would normally have a one-day winter meeting in Dublin, and we have our 4-day summer meeting in Lismore under normal circumstances. A full day is we thought a full day might be a little difficult on people, so we started off this year's event on the 25th of January, and that celebrated Robert Boyle's birthday. So that was very nice to be able to mark that occasion. And that was with Anthony Staines. And then we more recently had Luke O'Neill speaking about COVID. But the Robert Boyle Summer School is all about celebrating science in our culture. And in addition to looking at what science is doing now and into the future, we always look at the history of science as a guide. And the understanding about the history of science helps us understand more about contemporary science. And in fact, I think that if you don't know something about the history of science, you're missing out on a fuller understanding of contemporary science. So we were able to start our lecture series on the 25th of January in our winter school, and we were delighted to be able to finish it today on the 22nd of March, which is Catherine Boyle's birthday. And Catherine Boyle became Lady Ranelagh and was Robert Boyle's older sister. We're delighted to have Michelle DiMeo here to talk about Robert, Catherine, and the Great Plague of 1665-66. But before that, I want to just run through, and by way of introduction of the audience to each other and to our speaker, something that we're able to do as we come into a live event, we chat to each other, and we get to know something about each other before we start. And this is a poor substitute for that, but just to go through the questionnaire you filled in, 52% of you have been to a previous Robert Boyle winter or summer school. So we're delighted to meet you again, and we're also delighted to welcome a new cohort. About half the audience here haven't been before, so we're delighted to meet you and welcome you. About 2/3 have a background in STEM related to science, technology, engineering, and maths, and about 1/3 then don't. So that's very important for us, that we're not just scientists speaking to scientists. That really would be of limited use to us. We're very interested in including non-scientists in science. And that has been a cornerstone of the Boyle Summer School since we began. It's about people coming together to discuss science in our culture. So particularly the people who don't have a science background, we're delighted to see you. Most people are watching on computer. That's good. Hope people who are on mobile phones are able to follow us. If not, if you miss out on any slides or that, we will be posting a recording shortly on the website. Are arts, science, culture, and heritage important to you? Very important for 82% and somewhat important for the rest. And nobody said it wasn't important to them. So that's good. You're in the right at the right event. So how often do you engage with science events? A lot of people engage several times a year, and some people rarely. So in particular, the rarely people, we're delighted, and hopefully you'll make it a little bit more frequent with our events. Are you interested in events that highlight the contribution of women to science? And overwhelming majority of you are, and hopefully you will be interested in our summer school this June, which unfortunately we'll have to run online, and that's going to consider women in STEM, past, present, and future. So we hope to see you there. And now, do you think history gives us a better understanding of the scientific process? And again, overwhelmingly, people believe that. And I would say one thing, I would love to be talking to an audience of 98% thinking that it wasn't important, because we badly need to win over scientists and STEM people to take more of an interest in the history of science. It's very instructive. I'd like to thank our sponsors. We're primarily CalMast at Waterford Institute of Technology. We work in association with the Lismore Heritage Centre, the Robert Boyle Institute, and other people interested in the place of science in our heritage. And we are funded by Science Foundation Ireland and a number of groups in the southeast, such as Bosch and Lomb, Sanofi, MSD, Abbott, and West, and we're very grateful for those. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Michelle DiMeo. Michelle is the Arnold Thackeray Director of the Othmer Library at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia in the United States. Her research focuses on the intellectual and cultural history of early modern science and medicine, with particular interests in domestic science, medical remedies, and women practitioners. She is the leading authority on Catherine Boyle, Lady Ranelagh, the older sister of Robert Boyle, and of course, Lady Ranelagh was a highly influential person in her own right, as Michelle will explain. Michelle's book, Lady Ranelagh, The Incomparable Life of Robert Boyle's Sister, has been delayed due to COVID, but will be upon us soon. It is to be published in May, and we would earnestly recommend it to everyone. Michelle has a PhD in English and History from the University of Warwick, and she previously held the position of Director of Digital Library Initiatives at the Science History Institute and at the College of Science of Physicians at Philadelphia. Michelle is a regular contributor to the Robert Boyle Summer School, having spoken at the inaugural summer school in 2012 and again in 2015, where she introduced us to the remarkable Catherine Boyle, Lady Ranelagh. And now we're delighted that Michelle can join us today from Philadelphia to tell us about Robert Boyle, Lady Ranelagh, and the Great Plague of 1665 and 66.
Thank you, Owen. I'm going to try to share my screen.
Oh, while Michelle is doing that, I should point out that if you want to make comments or ask questions throughout the event, if you pop them in the chat, which you'll see a little call out icon at the bottom of your screen, and if you'd like to type in your questions there, we'll get them to Michelle at the end of the talk.
Okay. Are you looking at the correct view?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. It's a really exciting way to be celebrating Lady Ranelagh's 406th birthday to be speaking with you today. So many of you have heard me talk previously about Lady Ranelagh and how important she was to developing Robert Boyle as the supposed father of chemistry and one of the most important and influential scientists of his day. But in today's talk, I'm not going to give you the entire life, but I'm going to focus on one snippet of their life, which is the year that they both lived through the plague. And I think you might find that there are some surprising similarities with what we're experiencing with COVID-19 today. So to introduce them a little bit, Here's some portraits of the two of them. The Robert Boyle portrait actually hangs three floors below me in our museum. And the photo of Lady Ranelagh was shared with me from the Earl of Cork and Orrery. Lady Ranelagh is 12 years older than her little brother, Robert Boyle. And when Robert was born, he was only 3 years old when his mother died. So his older sister, Catherine, very much shaped him into the scientist that he becomes in his life. The both of them were born in Ireland, but they lived most of their adult lives in England. And Boyle never marries, and Lady Ranelagh separates from her husband at 28 years old. She leaves him in Ireland, she takes her 4 kids and relocates to London in 1644. And throughout their lives, they become very much a huge influence and very much each other's intellectual and emotional partners throughout their lives, finally living together for the last 23 years of their lives. They died within 1 week of each other in 1691. And this is the quote above, "Such a sister became such a brother." The Bishop Burnet, when he gives the eulogy for Robert Boyle, commemorates that Lady Ranelagh was, quote, "She lived the longest on the publicest scene and was the greatest figure in all the revolutions of the kingdoms for above 50 years of any woman of our age." And he says, "Such a sister became such a brother." She is so important, and all of her contemporaries knew that. So you might be wondering, if she was so important and all of her contemporaries knew this, why don't you know anything about her? And part of that is because of how history has been for women. She was very influential, and everyone knew that at her time. But it would have been improper for a woman to print her thoughts, to go for publications the way that her brother did. And it would have been improper for her to preserve her archive and to amass everything and actually have a heritage the way that her brother Robert Boyle did. And so much of my research over the past 15, 20 years has been traveling around, finding evidence of her scattered in the archives of her brothers and her male friends and people who preserved the letters that she sent. So what we have is an imperfect record of her life, but something that must have been absolutely remarkable. So in today's talk, like I said, we will be focusing on 1 year. So we'll talk a little bit and say, what was it like to experience a pandemic in 1665, 1666? What did the scientists and medical practitioners know? And how did our main characters here, Robert Boyle and Lady Ranelagh, respond to this crisis? And finally, we'll conclude by asking, are there any lessons that we can learn from 350 years ago? They say history repeats itself, and I think that when you look back at some of the stories that happened in the past, we can definitely learn from them today. So to begin my story, I won't give you too many slides that are date heavy, but I do want to contextualize when this was in history. So as I said, Boyle and Ranelagh, they're born at the beginning of the 17th century, and Lady Ranelagh moves to London in 1644. This is right when the start of the English Civil Wars are happening. It's right after the Irish Rebellion. She lives through the interregnum. It's a very, very crazy couple of decades before the plague even hits. But it's also a time of the increased institutionalization and formalization of science and medicine. This is the founding of the Royal Society in London, happens in 1660. We know that Robert Boyle is one of the founding fellows and is very much involved in this society. The College of Physicians has been around for a long time, but they become the Royal College of Physicians, and there's more standardization for how to become a physician at this time as well. And so when the Great Plague of London hits in 1665, Ranelagh has already been very much living in this city for quite a while. And it's not, and the Fire of London hits right after that. The plague hits in April for the first time in 1665, and the fire is in September of 66. It's about 18 months after the city's already been devastated by plague. The fire hits as well. And so as you can imagine, many people at that time saw this as God's wrath against them for misbehaving and not following his rules. And many people saw this as a divine punishment against them. And so once the fire, the plague and the fire, the plague ends sometime around at the end of 1666. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but to this day, we don't know entirely why it stopped, but it did. We think that the fire may have helped in that, but it was already in decline before the fire hit. And many people had actually been moving back to London around that time. But by the end of 66, the plague does taper off and stops. And then it's a couple of years after that that Robert Boyle moves into Lady Ranelagh's home in the Pall Mall in London. And they lived together for 23 years of their lives. And I put this up here partly also to show you that by the time Boyle moves in, Ranelagh has already been living in London for over a couple of decades. She already knows everyone. She's introducing him to members that he hadn't known yet. And she's very much a part of London. London was her place before it was Robert Boyle's. So let's talk a bit then about the public experience. What was it like to be in London at that time when the plague starts? Well, you left if you could. And of course, that would partly depend on if you had money and resources and family that you could flee to. But the trouble began in April of 1665. It was the worst plague outbreak in England since 1348. And it began taking over the country, but it was the worst in London because it was overcrowded. During the warm summer months, the disease started to spread. And by September of 1665, it was claiming the lives of roughly 8,000 people per week. London is estimated, it's tough to know for sure from historical records how many people passed, but we believe about 15% of the population of London was lost at that time. Now, this was all happening, like I said, for about 18 months when the Fire of London then hits as well. So the Fire of London started in the house of the King's Baker, which was down by London Bridge. And that fire raged for 4 days, and the wind carried it throughout the packed streets of London. The houses were made of timber, some of them had straw roofs, and the fire just completely decimated the city. It's estimated to have burned over 13,000 houses in 84 churches and 44 company halls. We don't think the death toll was too bad, but over 100,000 people were left homeless. This was an estimate of about a sixth of London's population. So it was an absolutely devastating thing to be living through at this time. So what would you do if you were living and in this time period and fire, you have the fire raging, but even before that, the plague is spreading everywhere and you feel helpless and scared? How are you dealing with it? One of the first things everyone did was actually turn to self-treatment. And that might surprise you today, but I'm going to give you a little bit of context for why that was the case. And I also want to break down the idea that it was only done by people who couldn't see a doctor, because actually the doctors did this too. So this image that I have here is a recipe book. Recipe books in this time didn't just have cooking recipes in them. They had medical recipes as well. And there is a wonderful Boyle family recipe book at the Wellcome Library in London that has recipes from both Robert Boyle and Lady Ranelagh and other Boyle family members incorporated in it as well. This one here is one that's at the Folger Library here in DC. And you can tell by looking at it, it's absolutely gorgeous. So many of these books, there was so much love and attention put into them and expense because they were passed down from generation to generation, and they were seen as treasuries of knowledge. And that's exactly what they were. This was the first place you would turn. If the plague hit your house or someone that you knew and loved, you would check your recipe book at home first and see if you could make something that someone had approved and said was helpful. You can also see here, this is actually a scribal hand. It's very beautifully written to make the plague water. But I have here a transcription, so you can look at it. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but there's a couple of important takeaways on what we're looking at. What is the plague water? Well, it's a ton of different herbs and spices. One could find them in their herb gardens at home. You could identify the plants and make them. You could also buy them in stock at the market, or you would go to your apothecary and you could get some pre-made mixtures. But what is interesting, I think, not just the incredible amount of ingredients, because there are a lot of them in here, but also how much there is. A pound of rosemary is a lot of rosemary. I'm sure you can imagine there's huge quantities. Pick all of your herbs, cut them very small, and then use 3 gallons of sack or white wine. So we have alcohol, 2 quarts of brandy, and then you would distill this at home and make a batch. So it's a massive amount that you'd be making. You would distill this in a huge batch, and then you could make smaller amounts and distribute them to other people or trade them. This image here, I think, is very telling. This is from a cookbook that the women are doing pastry, but they're also doing chemistry. Women were expected, as part of their household duties, to be able to do the practical distillation in their households. This was not yet separated from women's duties at this time. So, and if you want to learn more about this recipe, Cooking in the Archives, I think, is a great blog. You can check out more there. But this would be your first port of call. You would try to use your recipe book or get something. And like I said, it's not just the women who are doing this, it's everyone. Everyone starts with household care before they go to doctors. And at the time of the plague, Boyle is doing the same. Here's a letter that he writes to Henry Oldenburg, who was the secretary of the Royal Society. And he's describing that he's doing a lot of research, trying to find in his practical medical books what he can do to help with the plague. And he finds in his personal collection a book. He doesn't name what book it is, but he says it has a catalog of all the simples and other easily parable medicines that have been found successful against the plague. And this is important. He says simple and easily parable medicines. This is actually a reaction against this kind of medicine that has, gosh, I didn't even count the ingredients, but probably over 20 ingredients. Boyle is actually very interested in simplifying home medicine. He wants people to find remedies that maybe have 3 maximum number of ingredients that can be used by themselves to help themselves feel better. And so he's found this book. It was printed in 1605, and the book's out of print now, and it's quite a thin little book. But what he says is that maybe at London, or maybe here, he's in Oxford at the time, maybe some bookseller could reprint it. And maybe a physician would be able to look at this and supplement the recipes that have been approved in the Great Plague that happened since this book was made in the year 1605. He concludes saying, I would willingly part with my book on such an occasion. So he's advocating at this time to try to get more information into the public's hands so that they can treat themselves during this disease. So in addition to what happens if you do get sick, quarantine was a big thing back then too. You've probably, I think of the Monty Python skit, the Bring Out Your Dead with the bell. I mean, this was a thing. They really did have people that went down the streets. They were called body collectors. And you would bring, you had the Red Cross to mark if you had the plague in your house. People were told to stay inside. Body collectors would come. There were mass burials for individuals. They couldn't keep up with the amount of people who died. And then there were people called searchers. And these tended to be older women. And it was a dangerous job and not very pleasant, but they would go through the corpses and they would try to identify how they died, and they would inform the parish. And that's how the parish church officials would update the bills of mortality that we have today. So this is why partly our numbers for how many people died of the plague are not 100% accurate, because we don't know for sure. It was posthumously diagnosed a lot of the time, because most of the doctors did not want to go near these houses. So I would say, that you could try to find a doctor in this time. It's probably not going to be the physician that you were seeing for other things. There were specifically plague doctors who dealt with the plague. And in some ways they have the separate doctors today, where there's wings, at least in the States, where we have our COVID patients are in one place, and people who do not have COVID but still have to see the doctor are in separate areas. It's a little bit similar, only you couldn't go to a hospital back then. But a plague doctor could come to you. They dressed in various ways to protect themselves. And those long beak masks that they wore were filled with herbs to try to clean the air. And this is because they knew that the disease was contagious, but they didn't understand exactly why. There were a lot of prevailing ideas at the time about how disease was transferred between people. And you could see that he's completely covered himself. He's cloaked, he's got gloves on. The mask has the herbs to breathe and cleanse the air. There's glass over the eyes, and he has a long stick, so he doesn't have to actually come to within 6 feet of you, not getting too close. This was the plague doctor outfit. The cleaning of the air was specifically because of miasma theory. This is the theory that the water itself, the air itself could, if it had stink and smell to it, this was the disease. And so the disease would transfer through the stench of the air. And because so many people were dying and the graves were not very deep, the stink was actually overwhelming. And they were afraid that smell was actually passing the disease around London at the time. So this is partly where that comes from. But the doctors who took these jobs, as you can imagine, a lot of them were younger doctors. Some of them may not have been accredited. It was not a glamorous job. And many doctors chose not to deal with plague patients. So this is my transition into the next part of my talk, which is what did the doctors and scientists do at this time? And the doctors did what the public did, which is flee London if you can. Some of them did stay behind, but not a ton. And you can see here from this image here of the runaways fleeing, it tends to be the more well-to-do. The king himself leaves London. He goes to Oxford. His courtiers in the court all relocate to Oxford. Anyone who had the ability to leave left. And so the doctors went with them because that is where their patients were. And there was still a lot to do as a doctor apart from dealing with the plague. So they left as well. Many of them did. And what did the scientists do at this time? So Robert Boyle, and I'll tell you a bit about Robert Boyle and Lady Ranelagh, and then one of their friends who took a different approach to this. So Boyle was living in Oxford since 1655 and spent extended times in London, but he goes, the second that this thing kicks off in London, he ends up returning to Oxford as well and decides to stay there. And as I mentioned, it's also a time when everyone is going to Oxford. So he's very much surrounded by the court. He has the rest of the physicians and the scientists. It was a very intellectually vibrant time to be in Oxford at this time and a bit removed from what was happening in London. The Oxford Gazette is published at that time. This is an early newspaper that was published because people did not want information to come from London. They were afraid to touch stuff. Again, it was partly the miasma theory, but they also weren't sure how things were spreading. There was the term fomites, you may have heard in science today when they're talking about COVID. It's the fact that an inanimate object can become infected if it's got the germs of a disease. That was an idea that was around since the 16th century. So there's different understandings of what's happening and how disease is being transferred at this time. So what's happening in Oxford? They've got a little bubble happening. This is their newspapers are published to get the news out to people. It's an official court publication to talk about different regulations. There's trade industries that are explained on here. This is how you got the news on what was happening and how bad the disease was. Once things settled down a little bit, everyone goes back to London and the Oxford Gazette becomes the London Gazette. So just because Boyle is in Oxford, it doesn't mean he's doing nothing. And it doesn't mean that, he was not on the front lines in London, but he was definitely doing something. So I mentioned earlier on, he's spending time, he talks about going to the libraries, he's researching what people did for plagues in the past. He's trying to find ways to help people and to give them information to help themselves, especially the poor. There was also a lot of information exchanged by letter at this time. This is what the letters looked like. This is one from Robert Boyle. It's not written during the plague, but I just wanted you to see what historians are looking at when we're in the archives. So you can see the seals there. This is the outside of a letter, and inside of it there might be packages of information or additional letters, and it's folded up with a seal on it. And this particular one is from the Royal Society, and it says, a paper deposited with Mr. Hooke as secretary to the Royal Society and not to be opened without the consent of the writer, Mr. Boyle. That's Boyle who's writing this. And then underneath it in a different handwriting, you see it says, received the 14th of October, 1680 by me, Robert Hooke. Present with, and then he lists a bunch of other folks in the Royal Society who were with him as witnesses. So a lot of times the letters that we're looking at in the archives have a date of, when the author sent it, as well as the date of receipt. It's endorsed, which is really helpful. And we do know that during the plague, just like now, the post was absolutely affected. It was hard to get paper. There were a lot of post went through London in order to go to other parts of the country, and the routes were not safe for people to go through. And so people lost touch with each other and had some difficulty getting in touch. But Boyle was trying, and if we go through his correspondence at this time, there's actually quite a few letters that he's writing to people all around to try to, find new remedies that people can work with. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is he has a series of letters with a doctor called Hugh Chamberlain at this time. And Hugh Chamberlain's basically talking about that a lot of poor people cannot stay home, they cannot quarantine, and that when they're sick, they're still going out, they have to. And what he writes to Boyle is this social recommendation saying, if we really want to stop the disease, we have to have people self-identify and say, I have symptoms, I'm feeling sick, stay home, and that the government then has to pay them some money and send them free medical care. And that is the way to help stop the disease, is to get people to stay home and actually support them to do so during this time, which we don't know if Boyle responded to that. There's no response, but he saved that letter in his archives. And it's an interesting idea. I think, again, this balance between not just the science, but also some of the social aspects that are involved in trying to contain a contagious disease. So Boyle's in Oxford, and Lady Ranelagh goes to her sister, Mary Rich. So Mary Rich is her little sister, and about a year older than Boyle, and she becomes the Countess of Warwick. She lives in Lees Priory. So this is about 40 miles outside of London. I've got the map today, so you can see how far out she was. But it was really a time of social isolation for her. She's out there, and we don't know a ton about what she's doing, but we do have letters that we know she lost contact with Robert Boyle for a while. And we know that because one of the letters that finally gets to him has anxiety from her in it, saying that she's been trying to reach him. She sent him about 3 letters. He hasn't responded. She was trying to send him post, and she says she'd missed the postman on the safe route. She has trouble getting paper because paper stock is low and it's not being made in London. So there's like a lot of anxiety in these letters. And she also mentions that being out there in Lees, that there's few studious persons, she says. And, being, again, she was in the center of it all in London, and Boyle is there with others in Oxford. She has no one really out there. So what does she do? She says she calms herself by reading Boyle's books. And this is something she's been doing for a long time. She reads drafts of his books. She comments on them before they go to publication. And that's what she's doing right now. She's comforting herself with Boyle by reading the stuff that he's published already, which I think is lovely. So she's doing that. The other thing that she is doing, in addition to writing to her family, is she's involved in writing a treatise about the plague. So it's not clear if she does this while she's in, it may have been started in Lees. It's very likely that it also happened after she does return to London once everything calms down a bit. But she writes a very lengthy treatise about this. I don't have the image. It's at the Royal Society today. This instead is a letter from Lady Ranelagh with her signature on it, so you could see her handwriting and what her letters looked like. But the discourse concerning the plague is at the Royal Society, and what she's upset about, it's not so much a medical or scientific track as a social and political track, where she's upset because after 1664, there's the Act of the Conventicles at the time that if you were in a group of larger than 5 people and you were praying, but you weren't using the Anglican prayer book, you could be imprisoned. And at that time, during the plague, people were being imprisoned, but because the plague was spreading and these prisons were overcrowded, as they are today, the plague spreads across that, and she's upset because these people are dying. And she writes a very long, articulate, and I think very convincing tract saying that why are we keeping these people in prisons? They're like murdering holes when all they've done is obey their conscience. So she's politically very aware and very socially active at this time. The other thing she's doing is, like I said, letter writing. She's keeping in touch with Boyle. Her brother, Richard Burlington in Ireland, is talking about coming to trying to come to London. And she writes back kind of like, are you crazy? And she says, please stay in Ireland. This is the worst plague we've ever seen. It is not safe for you to leave Ireland right now. So she's also trying to keep connected with her family. So Boyle and Ranelagh leave, but there were a couple of scientists who decided to stay in London. One of them is George Starkey. And what ends up happening is, unfortunately, he dies in the plague. So Starkey is an interesting figure in history. He was educated, he's actually colonial American. He was educated in Harvard College and practiced medicine in Boston until he ends up moving to London in 1650. He's only 22 years old. But he works with Boyle. He teaches him a lot of chemistry and alchemy at the time. And then Isaac Newton is also later inspired by him. This is in my library as well, but this is a manuscript that's Isaac Newton's handwriting. Newton copies George Starkey's manuscript, 1670, so a couple decades after it's written, and it's mentioned. He's called, I think, the American chemist on it. So this is Newton, Boyle, the major chemists are all inspired by Starkey. So he's an important figure. We don't have a picture of him. This picture is of Jan Baptist van Helmont, who is a Flemish physician that Starkey really admired. And what happens to him? He's involved in something called the pamphlet wars. So over this time when plague is raging, there's a couple different types of medical theories that are out. The main one, the people that have degrees at the College of Physicians, they're actually using a very old branch of medicine. You may have heard about leeches and people being forced to vomit and bloodletting. That was still what was being taught at Cambridge and Oxford at this time. It was based on the old concepts from Galen and Aristotle, where they read these ancient texts and used these theories to diagnose medicine today and try to keep the humors of the body in balance. But there were a bunch of other medical professionals who saw the value in chemistry and some advocates for integrating chemistry and anatomy that would later become the foundations of medicine today. And so Starkey is one of these members who is pushing this forward. But where he goes wrong is he decides to try to make the plague a political point for him. And so just like you see some of these warring things on social media today, where people are pitting against each other for making the plague to support their own political agendas, the same thing was happening then. They're publishing pamphlets, they're trying to get people on their side, and at the end of the day, it didn't help anyone, and poor Starkey dies. And actually the chemists have a backlash because so many of them say they're going to stay in London. They're not immoral like the other physicians who left their patients. They're going to stay and fight. But the reality is no one really knew how to treat the plague, and they ended up passing away. So Boyle and Ranelagh, like I said, take the more sensible and conservative route. They stay outside of London until it's over. And when Ranelagh finally does return, I'm not sure exactly when that was, but it was sometime in 1666, probably in the spring. She is there when the fire of London hits in September. And like I said, the fire is already, the fire comes at a time when the plague is tapering off. Some historians think that the fire may have officially put an end to it because it burnt down the houses. It probably killed some of the rats. And then as the houses were being rebuilt, they used brick, which would be more hygienic than some of the timber that people were using where the fleas might have been burrowing. So there's some theories that that might have happened. But Ranelagh was there when this hit, and Boyle was still in Oxford. And it was absolutely devastating for her to witness this. She writes to Oxford, and she says to Boyle that London is a ruinous heap, and it gave me the most amazing spectacle that ever I beheld. She says she found poor families and persons in the fields unhoused, and that she dispensed his charity to them. So again, this is while he's in Oxford, she's on the streets in London distributing his charity, which is likely money, maybe materials, clothes, but they're giving to the poor at this time, and they're sharing social responsibilities. This is 2 years before he actually moves in with her permanently. So it's another interesting, I think, commentary on the haves and have-nots that come up a lot in her letters. She says, all our news here are the sad stories of undone people, and those we have great abundance, but scarcity enough of pity towards them, whose wants will increase, as the charity of those that now relieve them will tire. She proposes that as this continues, one way that they might be able to help people who lost their jobs and lost their houses, she proposes a city of huts, which is a temporary housing measure until more houses are created, and that they might be able to create some short-term jobs for tradesmen and laborers. Her thought is that if we can give people housing and give them jobs, it will probably stop them from becoming angry and disorderly. So again, it's another interesting mix, I think, of social commentary there she has. So so to conclude then, and I'm gonna walk through my last part of this talk, which is to say what medical and scientific advice could we learn from 350 years ago. So just like now, the best defense is not to get it. Wear your PPE. I think while it might look silly, the PPE of the plague doctor, there's actually some similarities to today. Covering our eyes, we're covering our faces, we've got gloves, a long gown. Like I said, that stick, you can enforce your social distancing of 2 meters. So wear your PPE. Quarantine the sick, still doing that today. If you have symptoms, please stay home. Back then, as of now, I think it's hard for people to obey these dictates that are coming out, the public health initiatives. But as they noticed 350 years ago, the best way to contain this is to stop it from spreading. Follow the public health advice, even if it's not something that you personally believe in or something that is inconvenient or difficult for you. I think about George Starkey, where he saw everybody going out and he didn't. He chose to stay in London, despite the fact that everything was against him in doing that, and he wanted to do this, and he did not make it through. Which is why I finalize this by saying, keep your politics out of it. Follow the health things. This isn't about politics. This is about everyone keeping safe and thinking about ourselves as a country, as a world, and not as individuals right now. So what social advice can we learn from this as well? So it helps to have money. Then, as in now, there was a disparity between the haves and the have-nots and how they dealt with this. And those who are in need had social help. So it ranged from government officials putting in new programs, some temporary measures, as well as individuals volunteering, those who could help, which both Ranelagh and Boyle very much advocated for that, not just the scientific and medical advances, but also helping the poor at this time. You should also give yourself extra time when you're sending the post. This was, I think what was funny for me was over Christmas, it took a couple of months, I think, to send Christmas presents to my family from Philadelphia to Chicago and Los Angeles. But it was months for Lady Ranelagh as well, and she completely lost track of her family members for long periods of time, which made me very thankful for modern technologies. Because back then, they did not, of course, have the internet or the telephone. We couldn't be talking on Zoom today. And really, if you didn't have the post, you were completely cut off from everybody. If you were in Oxford, there were those news sources that were out, but it was very difficult for correct information to disseminate to people at that time. So we are very lucky, I think, at least, to have some official news sources that we can follow. And so I will conclude by thanking you for attending this talk. Owen mentioned in 2015 at the previous Robert Boyle Summer School, we did an unveiling of a plaque for Lady Ranelagh next to the plaque for Robert Boyle on the gates of Lismore Castle. And if you are lucky enough to be in Lismore today, I am not, but if you are, go say happy birthday to Lady Ranelagh. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. So if people have any questions, pop them in the chat. Just on the point of the plaque, yes, we're very grateful to the plaques committee who seek out worthy causes and erect plaques to people who were involved with STEM heritage. And I know Brian Smith from the Plaques Committee and a number of others are on with us at the moment. So we do admire your great work. So let's go to questions. The first one from Siobhan asks, was the disease that caused the plague in the 17th century the same as the bubonic plague that caused the Black Death in the 14th century?
I believe so, and I have the name of the bacteria written down, and now I'm forgetting. Yersinia, I'd have to pull this up. They, of course, did not know this at the time, and since then, we've been able to diagnose what this was. It's actually still around today, though. We now have antibiotics that can treat it, but it is not something that they knew how to treat at the time. This is previous to vaccines. This is also prior to antibiotics. So these are things we had to learn.
It reminds us how lucky we are to be living in this age.
Yeah. Evidence that anybody else was as socially conscious. So not as much. So Boyle and Ranelagh were actually a team on this. Both of them were very socially conscious. So it was not, I think that we often hear about Boyle as the great scientist, but if you look at his works, his first publications were actually all moral tracts. And towards the end of his life, he also published a lot. His will dedicates money specifically for Christian education and for lectures. They volunteered. They tried to get schools set up. Lady Ranelagh was also involved in a group called the Hartlib Circle, which was a group that was very active during the Civil Wars and interregnum period. And they were advocating, again, for social reform through disseminating knowledge. They very much thought knowledge was power, and that the more people knew, the more that they could free themselves of some of the challenges that they faced.
So Aoife asks, is it known why Catherine Ranelagh left her husband?
Yes, so it sounds like he was a drunk. They had a very unhappy relationship. He may have also been cheating on her, and she leaves him. And very, very uncommon, you might suspect, at the time for a woman to separate from her husband. And so she actually spends the next 2 decades advocating to try to actually get a formal divorce from him and alimony payments, which was very rare. But yes, he was not a good character.
Now, Antoinette is wondering, how could it be possible that the Great Plague didn't spread outside London, especially with so many folk fleeing to other places?
It did. It actually did flee to other places as well. And in fact, you mentioned people fleeing. So while King Charles II eventually ends up in Oxford, that's not the first place he goes. They actually go to Salisbury, and then it starts to spread there. So then they move out further. And Lady Ranelagh says where she lives that the plague is always 3 or 4 miles from her. And so she is not far from Chelmsford. So it's definitely spreading. You hear about this as the Great Plague of London because that's where it was the worst. But you're right that it did start to spread to other places as well. But if you were at those places and there's more social distancing taking place and people are less crowded, it just didn't spread as quickly.
And I suppose, like today, the colleges did close, didn't Isaac Newton famously spent a year at home learning without
You're right.
Zoom.
Yes, that's right. And the Royal Society closed down. So people, it was a couple months into the plague. Boyle had already left for Oxford. A few of his colleagues had stayed in the Royal Society, and then at some point that summer, they all left. So you're right. Everyone was home studying at the time.
And here's one from Bill Eaton. Were any of Ranelagh's recipes successful at treating the symptoms? To what extent do you think their friend John Locke collaborated with them to fight the plague?
So Ranelagh's recipes, it's difficult to say if they would have been. I have a list of a bunch of her recipes, and there's some that you can look at that you think, yes, this, we were trying to fight a vitamin D deficiency, and this would have improved vitamin D. So there are some that we can look at and make those claims. I remember at a previous Robert Boyle summer school, we actually dissected some of this, looked at some of the recipes as a group, and thought that, yes, some of them probably were effective. John Locke worked with Boyle to produce his medical recipes at the end of his life, and was involved in some of the medical receipts that got published in the medicinal experiments that were posthumously published in the 1692, I think it was. So whether he was involved with the plague, I'm not positive, but I know that he was mentioned in these conversations with Hugh Chamberlain about some of the hygiene measures to protect, and absolutely he was in Oxford too. So
thank you.
The next question is also from the United States. Didn't Boyle, this is Colm Mulcahy, says, didn't Boyle also fund the first Irish language Bible, and having grown up in an Irish speaking family, not his own, acts as a translator for his father?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, Lady Ranelagh's involved in that first Bible translation as well. But you're right, he funds that. He funded multiple Bible translations. He also worked on an Algonquin Bible translation here in colonial America. And yes, growing up as an Irish translator, yeah. And Boyle was known later in life as the English philosopher. He leaves Ireland so young that I don't think he travels continental Europe. Ranelagh is often referred to as an Irish woman, though, which is interesting. She lived in Ireland for much longer in her life, and Ireland comes up a lot in her correspondence as a place that I think she wants to improve, and has some like a love-hate relationship with parts, because she had to flee after being trapped in Athlone Castle during the rebellion. So yes. Where did they live in London before and after the fire? So the house in London that's after the fire is in Pall Mall, and that is where Boyle had his laboratory that Ranelagh built out. But that was after the fire. That's in 1668. Before that, she lives in Chelsea, and she moves a little further out in Stoke Newington. She has a house as well. But the house, and when Boyle would visit, so he lived in Oxford through most of the 50s, but he would spend extended periods of time in London, sometimes staying with Ranelagh, sometimes staying with other members to attend the Royal Society meetings. And also people would come to Ranelagh's house to meet with Boyle, because they knew that that's where they could find him.
Anyone else have any questions? Or if, they're coming in now. Siobhan asks, wasn't the Bible translation the brainchild of Narcissus March to proselytize the native Irish?
Yes, yeah. So March was involved in this, yeah. And then there is a lot of it's a lot of these things are difficult, I think, to read and today and remove the politics from it. I think that they genuinely thought that if they could communicate stuff to the native Irish, that they would see things the way that they saw things. And I think it was the same with the Algonquins. They were very much trying to educate people in what they found. Like I said, education is what they very much felt that education was a way of liberating yourself and learning more and being very empowering. So they saw these translations, like I said, it wasn't just towards the Irish, but they spreading information, helping the poor. Translations was a way to empower people to learn more and empower themselves.
Of course, this area is quite fraught at the moment. Colonial studies, but we have to imagine that a number of people were quite sincere in their efforts. I mean, they didn't want to just go in and kill people and take their land. They were they were sincerely trying to help them. I would imagine. So if there's any other questions, or if people are unable to find the chat, we can allow people to unmute themselves and ask questions directly if you would like.
I see a question about how did she get away with being an influential woman? Was it because she was wealthy, other qualities? That is such a great question, because yes, I'm sure her wealth helped her. That's absolutely part of it. But again, being a religious woman, I think was a huge help as well. And she knew when not to overstep things as well. So like I said, she didn't publish under her own name. She would read Robert Boyle's publications, and then it would actually, she makes edits, but it's published under his name. And he at some point publishes something with an introduction to her saying, if only you were able to not confine your pen to letters, if you actually put your stuff out there for people, everyone would see how amazing you are. But she was quite modest. And so she knew how women could manipulate the public sphere without overstepping her boundaries.
There was, of course, a woman who wasn't so constrained at the time, the Duchess of Newcastle.
Yes. So Margaret Cavendish, gets her way into the Royal Society, and is very much discussed amongst all of the early scientists at the time. And she does publish, and she becomes very well known. But because of this, she meets with more criticism than respect from most of her contemporaries. And Ranelagh herself did not see an ally in her. She says she's the only reason she's mad enough to escape Bedlam is because she has so much money. So, women were not necessarily supporting each other at that time just because they were women.
Okay. Bill asks, what sparked your interest in Lady Ranelagh?
I was studying women's recipe books as a grad student, and was flipping through, and many of them looked like that one I showed you earlier with the Folger. But then there was a really strange one from a woman that had alchemical cipher in it and a bunch of like shorthand and chemistry that was much more advanced than the other women's that I'd seen. And so I went to my dissertation supervisor at Warwick and said, "Who is this? This looks so different from the others." And she gasped and said, "That is Boyle's sister. That is your dissertation." And so began 20 years of researching this woman, and I've never been bored.
Okay, and that's a very nice point to finish up on. Thankfully, you did have that experience, and you have spent 20 years working on it. And for the last almost 10 years, we've known each other, and you have helped spread and make Irish audiences aware of Lady Ranelagh. And we thank you for that. And we look forward to your book, which is coming out soon. There are loads and loads of thank yous and complimentary comments being posted now, and everyone is looking forward to the book. And I hope, Michelle, that you'll be able to join us back again in June for the Robert Boyle Summer School, where we celebrate Lady Ranelagh again, and indeed all women in STEM, past, present, and future.
That
thank
sounds
you.
Fantastic. Thank you, and thank you, everyone.